Good afternoon. I'm very happy to be here. I arrived this morning from New York, so I think I'm the only native English speaker so far who's spoken, but I have a lot of notes just in case I need them. Thank you for that kind introduction. And thank you, Roman, because I think that is the most succinct account of the angels and demons of our nature that I've ever heard. It was brilliant. I'm going to talk a little bit today about my book, Stasiland, which came out 10 years ago in the English-speaking world and then in many countries around the world, but is now just available in Icelandic, which I'm very proud of. I think it's the 20th country or something like that, so thank you, Jakob, for that. I'm going to talk about some of the people that I wrote about in Stasiland. They were people who resisted the East German communist regime, and I'm going to talk about why they are not, at the moment, being honoured in Germany, why I think that is happening, and also about why, for me, this work against forgetting is the most important work that I could be doing. It's now a full generation, nearly 23 years since the Berlin Wall fell, so I think that a conference like this is a fantastic opportunity to re-examine where we are a generation later. In some ways, I was always being told when I was writing Stasiland in the 90s, it's too soon to write this, people are too sensitive about it, or by many Germans, we know everything that happened during those 40 years, what are you doing? There's nothing left to write. So I operated between those two extremes. Stasiland is a book about four main people, apparently ordinary, but actually quite extraordinary people, living at different times during that 40-year period of socialist rule. One is Miriam Weber, who as a 16-year-old tried to escape climbing the Berlin Wall for complicated reasons. Another is Frau Pohl, a housewife and a dental nurse living in Germany who had a baby in 1961. The baby was being cared for in a hospital in the western suburbs of Berlin. And in August, when the war went up, she was separated from that extremely sick child. She then was unable to reach the baby and not allowed to go by the Stasi, no visits, nothing. And she started trying to get out of the country. So the book contains also her life story. It's a story, really, of making dissidents out of your children and your housewives and the very ordinary people. There are four in the book. The third one is a fantastic man who's died now, as has Frau Pohl. I suppose that's a sign of the generation going on, who was the Eastern Bloc's version of Mick Jagger, or so he said. He was a louche alcoholic, very famous rock star called Klaus Renft. And when he once applied for permission to continue to perform with his group, the committee chairwoman, he had in communist countries you had to get permission to perform, declared to his face to him that he no longer existed. And his story in my book is about what happens to you when you are declared to no longer exist in a place like East Germany. These people are my heroes. They refused to betray those around them and collaborate with the regime, even though they knew it might cost them their sanity, their freedom, or their lives. Stasiland is an intimate exploration of human conscience and human courage. On the other side, Stasiland is a book about former Stasi men. So these are the secret police officers. They were men who accepted the politics of their day as a reality that could not, or perhaps should not, be changed. They worked within it. Some people might say that they were sensible to do that, like the opportunists Roman is talking about. If you wanted a career, an education for your children, a safe life, or even a holiday in Yugoslavia, you might then spy on your family and friends, open the boots of cars in transit to West Berlin, or spread disinformation in West Germany to manipulate the parliamentary votes there, which happened in 1972. My book is about how those men deal with their loss of power and about the kinds of contortions of conscience that they had to undertake to remain upright when the regime failed. In order to fully appreciate the courage of the people that I was really interested in, which I'm going to describe a little, it's worth reminding ourselves what they were up against when they refused to inform or betray or tried to escape and so on. The East German government maintained its power by subjecting people to fear and intimidation by the secret police. People were turned into informers or collaborators for the Stasi in order to stay safe from the Stasi. There were at least one informer for every 50 people. By CIA estimates, 1 person in 7. So in this room there would have been several of us who would later go and talk to a handler and say, did you hear what so-and-so muttered at the coffee, and so on and so forth. It was a way of making sure no one could trust anyone else or say anything out loud. In the early days, there were many deaths, or as they called it, liquidations of opponents in the early days of the GDR regime. In the 70s and 80s, the regime preferred to psychologically destroy opponents by spreading rumors, ruining careers, marriages, taking children away, or to exile people. East Germany was the only country in the Eastern Bloc which could expel its malcontents, dissidents, writers and intellectuals into West Germany, because the West Germans maintained the view that all of those Germans were automatically entitled to citizenship in West Germany. So I actually came to looking at this while I was an undergraduate in West Berlin, because in the late 80s, well, 87, 88, so just before the wall fell, I fell in with a group of former East Germans who were writers and painters mainly, who had been exiled from their own country. And we would sit having coffee in West Berlin, and at the end of the street was the wall. And over that wall were my friends' families, in some cases children, certainly their whole past. And this Berlin Wall cut through Europe, obviously, but it cut through their lives. And I think that was the initial impetus for me to go and find out, once the wall had fallen, what really happened there. The Stasi's practical methods demonstrate an institutional pathology of inventive malice and utter disregard for human dignity. The Stasi broke into flats and stole people's underwear, bottling it as smell samples so they could train a dog to recognize your scent by your bodily odor. I've seen these jars. My book is full of black humor and ironies. The ironies are not actually funny, they're only funny on the surface. But one of them is that shortly after the wall fell, I went into the Leipzig Stasi kind of warehouse, where there were row upon row of these jars, which looked like the jars that you make jam in. And they had labels on them, and the label would say a date, 1984, an object, workers' underpants. You have to imagine the Stasi agent climbing into your flat, going through your dirty underwear, literally your dirty underwear. When I saw them, these jars were empty. It was early 90s, and I said to the woman who was showing me around, so where are the bits of cloth? Where's the underwear? She said she was a member of the citizens' rights movements. We don't know. In the chaos at the end of 1989, somebody, whether it's the federal police in Germany or whether it's the local Leipzig police or who, thought, well, these smell samples might become useful to us in this new regime of open Germany. So somewhere there exists a complete smell sampling of the entire opposition in Saxony. We just don't know where that is. The Stasi used to irradiate people and objects with radiation, with very damaging consequences, but they invented personal Geiger counters that could be strapped to the body. So a Stasi agent in Mufti would be able to follow you kind of with something ticking on them, literally, as you went through the crowd, also to follow a manuscript if it was making its way to West Germany for publication and so on. The sine qua non of the German Democratic was the vicious war that it waged on its own citizens, whom it turned into traitors or asocials, these are my translations, but they're very literal, or most spectacularly, negative enemy elements by the stroke of a bureaucratic pen. The Stasi and its vast network of informers accumulated in the 40 years of its existence, from 49 to 89, more written records than in all of German history since the Middle Ages. These written records were largely what I call the stolen biographies of their countrymen and women. When I started writing Stasiland in 1997, the ex-Stasi men had apparently evaporated. Whether they evaporated out of fear of lynching, as I mentioned before, or of legal retribution, which actually never came, or possibly out of shame, no one could tell. Many people also think that the Nazis disappeared somehow after the fall of the Nazi regime. Of course, this is not the case, and Professor Courtois referred to this. The regime dies, but its personnel remain in situ. I was curious. I was told at that time, you will never find these men, they will never talk to you. And I thought, well, and the woman who told me that had been doing a master's on Stasi men, and she had written 147 letters and letter dropped them in these vast apartment buildings in Marzahn, a district where many party members and Stasi officers lived. She got 3 responses, and they were all carefully worded replies, anonymous, giving her the reasons why these men would not talk to her. I thought, I have no patience for that. I'm a writer, I'm not doing any scientific study here. So what I did was take out an advertisement in the local paper in Potsdam, which is where many ex-Stasi lived. And my German is reasonable, but I wasn't confident about it, and I had a German person check my German. Anyway, despite my care in having the wording of this advertisement checked, what it actually said was, Australian writer seeks Stasi men, view conversation, publication in English or something. And it had my home phone number. At that time, we didn't have mobile phones. I certainly didn't have enough money to have one, even if they had existed. So I had the phone of the flat that I was living in Berlin, and it just rang hot, to my surprise, day or night, with anonymous, sometimes heavy breathing, sometimes very anxious men wanting to tell me their story. So I made a series of assignations with Stasi men, and they are in the book. They range from the kind of fairly ridiculous, where somebody won't give me his name, says, I'll meet you at 1500 hours outside the church in Potsdam. I will be the one with the Potsdamer Allgemeine rolled up under my left arm, and so on and so forth. I said, well, I'll be the woman with the tape recorder. To, the ridiculous, where a man one of them very solemnly handed me a beautiful little East German edition of the Communist Manifesto, and said at the end of our talk, perhaps now you can go and sow the seeds of socialism in a corner of the world where people are not prejudiced against us, meaning Australia. So I think all of the Stasi men to whom I sent the book before it was published were disappointed. They were in fact so disappointed, well, I'll explain later how I know that they were so disappointed. Now there's a battle waging in Germany about how the GDR is going to be remembered. The former cadres would like it to be remembered as some kind of benign leftist social welfare experiment, idealistic and well-intentioned in looking after people from cradle to grave, if perhaps a tad overzealous in its implementation. Former human rights activists, political prisoners, and historians of left and right would have it remembered as it was. Then it might serve as a warning to future generations about the dual seductions of belief and obedience. Have I got till 1:45? I've got till 1:45. Oh, excellent. A growing degree of what's called in German Ostalgie, which is this wonderful combined word combining nostalgia and the East, Ost, so it's nostalgia for the East, is, I think, a toxic rose-coloured fantasy, and it infects representations of the late GDR. A visit to the new GDR museum in Berlin would leave you with the impression that the Stalinist dictatorship was essentially an exercise in mid-century domestic kitsch and a liberated nude bathing culture. For €54, you can stay in the Stasi suite of a hotel, offering you an Eastern experience, minus the interrogation or arbitrary imprisonment. Or you might take a trabby ride to one of the proliferating DDR stores and come away that consumers were happy back then with what was on offer. I've heard countless examples of the insidious misremembering of those who can't afford things in a capitalist society, wanting to go back to a past where there was nothing to buy and nowhere to go, and anyone who complained about that could have their life destroyed. There were some things that could have been examples to us in the West. The documented better sense of self-worth and autonomy of women in the GDR, as opposed to unified Germany, is an important one. But nothing is worth the price some people paid. One of them is my friend Miriam. In the late 1960s, the Leipzig authorities destroyed a very beautiful church called the Universitätskirche in Leipzig with no public consultation. Miriam was a 16-year-old schoolgirl, and she and a friend, Ursula, decided that this was outrageous. At 16, she said, you know, you're braver than you think you are, and you think you can change the world. And they made leaflets protesting, saying, if you want to pull down our cultural heritage, you need to consult us. And they pinned these things around town. They were caught by the Stasi. These children, 16-year-olds, were put on remand for a month with no lawyer, no contact with their parents or anything. When they were released to await their trial, Miriam knew she was going to go back to prison, and she got a train for Berlin and tried to climb the Berlin Wall. She very nearly made it. This story and what happened to her later is that kind of anchor, bookend story of Stasiland. When she was caught, the judge at her trial, who had already started referring to her by number, part of the dehumanizing of dissidents was to get rid of their names and give them numbers. She was prisoner 725. Your sentence is particularly harsh, he said to her, because you could have started World War III. And that was because, his reasoning went, if the Eastern Guards had shot at her at the wall strip in Berlin, the Westerners might have shot back, and then Armageddon would have been upon us. When she was released, she was 17 and a half, and Miriam has told me, you know, I was barely human. There was an extremely brutal experience in this women's prison called Hoheneck. But she met a young man who was a sports teacher called Charlie and a poet, and they married. In the mid-70s, Helmut Schmidt, the Chancellor of West Germany, was meant to be visiting East Germany. So the East German government rounded up anybody and everybody and put them in custody, really as a preventive means of stopping any kind of public demonstration or anything that might happen to embarrass them in the face of the West at that time. They arrested Charlie. They held him for several months, and at the end of that period, Miriam got a postcard in her letterbox which said, your visitation right has been cancelled. You need to come and collect your husband's things. And she didn't know what that meant, and she turned up in the prison, and what that meant was they were giving his belongings because he had somehow very mysteriously died in his cell. She's a woman who's now spent the rest of her life, for the rest of that time from mid-70s to 89, battling the Stasi, trying to get information out of them, which you can say that in one sentence, but you really have to, I'm not here selling books, but you have to read the book to know what that actually means. And now, since the regime has fallen, she's been trying to find out from the Stasi archive what happened to her husband in custody. So for me, it was this, she's a wonderful, very funny woman with an extraordinary story that encapsulated so much about how the regime worked or didn't. I asked her recently, I was back in May, how she feels now about the GDR. Good, she said. Fundamentally, I feel free. Of course, she added, die Alten sitzen da. She meant that the old cadres from the Stasi and the Socialist Unity Party are still in their positions of relative privilege. So some of you may have seen the film The Lives of Others, for instance, which portrays a former Stasi man very down on his luck who delivers junk mail and who falls in love with a dissident couple he's observing, tries to save them, and subsequently is thanked by the man that he was watching, all of which is never ever happened and is an utter fantasy. And it's important to know why it could never have happened, which is because totalitarian regimes are total, the systems of control never allow one person to be in charge of an operation and be able to change their mind. You would have had 14 people on that operation doing that. But the other misrepresentation in that film, which is really crucial, is that the Stasi are somehow down on their luck. They're not. They got snapped up by Western business and enterprise because they had exactly the educations and the work histories that they denied the people that they persecuted. They're very useful. They adapted very well to capitalist enterprise. But Miriam is a producer at the state radio station in Leipzig. So this is the state-funded public radio. And among her managers are ex-Stasi informers. At the 20th anniversary commemorative demonstration of the demonstrations in 1989, she told me that one of the things that happened was that the bosses, who are ex-Stasi or informers, made sure that they rostered on anyone that they knew was a former dissident so that that person couldn't go and carry their candle in the important demonstration of 20 years after the Velvet Revolution. Miriam laughed about it. She has a gift of distilling humour from the blackest of ironies, I think so as to ward off despair. She said, it's right though, in a way, you know, that they went to the demonstrations in 2009 and we didn't, because they were there in the crowd 20 years ago. They were there as informers. So what does it do to a society and to its ability to accurately remember a dictatorship in the recent past, to have those loyal to it still sitting in positions of state responsibility? The judge who signed the warrant for Charlie's arrest, which after the fall of the wall was found to be baseless, is still a judge making decisions on the bench in Saxony. So we have to ask ourselves, did this man switch overnight from being someone who got his orders from the political police to condemn the demonstrators for democracy to someone who can suddenly uphold the values that they were demonstrating for? At the radio, Miriam told me that also that one of the effects... let me just keep going. Yeah. Miriam's most senior boss, who's now in charge of this radio station, was actually responsible. He had experience in radio in the communist regime because he was responsible for political commentary at the radio station of the GDR, Stimme der DDR. So it's kind of mind-boggling that, you know, it's like the king is dead, long live the king, the regime is dead, long live the regime, they're still there. So the question that we ask about him is, was he able to change from being a spokesperson for a dictatorship to being a part of the fourth estate, a bulwark against dictatorship? In this part of the world, we have to remember, there has been no democracy since 1933. Miriam told me some of the effects of having ex-Stasi bosses at the radio station. After the fall of the wall, the SED, which was the Communist Party of East Germany, had millions and millions of Deutschmarks, Reichsmarks, which disappeared. It's widely suspected that those funds have gone into funding the successor party to the SED Communist Party, called the Party of Democratic Socialism, which has now changed its name to Die Linke. Miriam told me once that the order came through from these ex-Stasi informers that they no longer wanted to refer to the PDS as the successor party to the SED every time it was mentioned on radio, in order to not make apparent that connection between the two parties. Now they've changed the name altogether and they're just called Die Linke. Another friend of mine who is one of the main voices in Germany to call for accurate remembering is the historian Hubertus Knabe, who is the director of the museum which used to be the main prison in Berlin for political prisoners, called Hohenschönhausen. Dr. Knabe says that Miriam's experiences have seeing this judge still on the bench or former cadres controlling the media are quite typical. He says after the wall fell, there was barely any holding to account of those in power for their crimes. Almost all the high-level functionaries retained their positions and their full pension rights and are now much better off than their former victims. Knabe says, you get more compensation if you are a warder in Bautzen, which was a notorious jail, than if you were a prisoner there for 10 years. Similarly to the Nazi period, Knabe says, the overvaluing of continuity of administrative experience. I've heard this so many times in Germany where people say after 1945 there simply weren't enough, you name it, judges, administrators, teachers, lawyers, whoever. We couldn't train them all up, so we had to use the old guard and we had to use party members and so on. And Knabe says that was a big mistake after the end of this regime. There simply weren't enough people who were retrained, so the old cadres stayed in office. What this means, he says, that if a teacher wants to bring their school class to his museum, where you see cells in which political prisoners were held, including Frau Paul, a character from my book, you see Mielke's office, the head of the secret police, you see all these things. It's important for school children in Germany now to see that. But because the teachers are likely to be teachers who were teaching the old regime, this will obviously finish as time goes on, they don't bring their children there. They don't bring the school classes there. And a result of that is that in 2009, so a while ago now, they're my last figures, a survey found the GDR to have its highest approval rating since unification 20 years before. 57% of people agreed with the statement that the GDR was more good than bad, and a majority of school children were under the illusion that it had been a legitimate, democratically elected government. I have some small experience myself of ex-cadres. The book was launched in, the ironies are so thick and fast, launched in the former headquarters of the Stasi in Leipzig, at the Leipzig Book Fair in 2004. So it was, the room we were in was this vast ballroom. It was literally the secret policeman's ballroom. And I got up, and when I got up to speak, it was a grand room. The whole front row was full of, I don't know exactly who they were either party members or Stasi people, because they were wearing the uniform, which involved being middle-aged, having a bomber jacket on, Brill cream in your hair, and being very, very fierce. They were very angry at me, and as soon as I started speaking, they were taking notes and huffing and puffing really viciously. And at which point I switched from being really frightened to thinking, this is outrageous. You can't take notes on me now. What are you going to use those notes for? You can't hold that against me. But after the book came out, a group of ex-Stasi men who used to be called in the 90s Das Insider-Komitee, the Insider Committee, this group changed its name because they're kind of very adept at the PR that is required in capitalist society, changed their name from the Insider Committee to the Society for the Protection of Civil Liberties and the Dignity of Man. This rolls off the tongue. Group of ex-Stasi men, they sued my German publisher about this book, and I'm not sure if it's going to be the same page on the Icelandic edition, but on page 84, I always say this, of the English language editions, there's a couple of paragraphs where I outline what groups of ex-Stasi did in the 90s after the fall of the wall to harass former dissidents. And these involved things like delivering pornography to someone's wife who didn't order it, or a ticking package to the door, or cutting brake leads, making people have car accidents, or taking someone's child after school for a few hours to make everybody panic and things like that. All of those things were true, but the power of these groups is such that my German publisher deleted that paragraph in all future editions of the book, and not only that, it's now gone to a much bigger publisher in Germany, Fischer, and they have kept that out of the book. So whether that is a sign of some kind of silence or how these things go, I don't know. All it really means for me is that I talk about it everywhere I go and turn people to page 84. I was in Berlin in May. I was watching television and I was watching an interview with a politician from Die Linke, so the successor party to the SED. And I noticed that he was still trying to convey the myth of the benign, well-intentioned dictatorship. He extolled the universal free childcare in the GDR, healthcare and education, the low rents and affordable food prices, Of course, he said, some mistakes were made. When he said this, it rang in my ears, because I remember long ago speaking to people who had lived through the Nazi regime, and I'll never forget one of them saying to me, well, that stuff with the Jews went too far, but that aside, they were good times. There was no unemployment, we built the freeways, and so on and so on. I think that this instrumental use of people, which Roman was describing so well, for a greater mythologized cause, whether of right or left, of Aryan purity or a master race or a communist utopia, is something that goes against the basic humanity of the individual. Goethe said, long before Germany's catastrophic 20th century, nations, like human beings, are unaware of the workings of their inner nature, and ultimately we are surprised, even astounded, at what emerges. To write of any nation, as many of us have, is to intervene in its history in one way or another. It's to eliminate certain silences, to spotlight certain struggles. If you've been able to tap into what it is to be human, which is after all the job of a writer, you're writing for people in similar situations all over the world. I think that the story of resistance to illegitimate dictatorial power, which is also the subject of my latest book, which is a novel coming out of the Nazi period, I think that this theme of resistance to illegitimate power is eternal, and I think it's universal. I could have written both my books with differences of surface detail about situations throughout history, or indeed now. I could have set them in Russia or China or Libya or Burma or North Korea, Argentina, or any number of other countries where power is concentrated in an unelected government and sustained by force using an internal security service. As Lord Acton had it, power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So just to finish, the details change, but the forces in play remain the same, as do the extraordinary and more ordinary human responses, conscience and courage on the one hand, and capitulation and compromise on the other. My books are works of art, obviously, or are trying to be, but they are also acts of witnessing. It's important to hear stories from before so that our ears will be attuned for the whistleblowers to come when power starts to concentrate again in a way that threatens us. An individual's dissent can be the price of freedom for the rest of us. I'd like to finish with the words of the great American contemporary novelist Marilyn Robinson. She says, "A successful autocracy rests on the universal failure of individual courage. A democracy relies on its exercise. I think we would be wise to learn to cherish it in one another." Thank you very much.